Partito.
Okay.
Okay. Well, hello, have we connected?
This is Christy. I hear you well and see the slides.
Oh, okay. Well, hello, everybody. This is Donal O'Mahuna, and Professor Christy Koenig is with us as well. And what we're going to do today is give you a general introduction to the module and an overview where ethics gets involved with disaster medicine. So what I will do is go down through the slides, and we'll be able to then take some time at the end for some questions. My own background is that I started in pharmacy, but then developed an interest in the ethical issues of pharmacy and then healthcare more generally. And I've been involved in evidence-based medicine for a number of years through the Cochrane collaboration. And in recent years, they have initiated an interest in conducting further research in disasters to provide evidence for the types of decisions that have been made. And through that, they asked me to begin to look at the issues around the ethics of conducting so Christy, did you want to say anything about your background and interest in ethics?
Just that I think it's a fascinating and difficult topic, especially when we're working with people from different cultures, different religious beliefs. So it's one of the most interesting and exciting topics to me for the EMDM, and we will have some very interactive sessions when we come together at the residential course, which I think will challenge people, and I believe it's very important to think through these issues ahead of the event because there are some really difficult ethical challenges when we come to situations with scarce resources. So this is an issue I've been working on for a time, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Okay, thanks. And at the end, I'll mention a project that I'm involved with, an EU-wide project looking at ethical issues in disaster response. But our aim here in this unit is to initially just generate an awareness of the ethical issues and a place where you can start to think about them, discuss them. We have found, or I have found in recent years, is that many people are aware that there are dilemmas, there are problems, there are really confusing and difficult situations or may not have appeared to have an ethical foundation, but that part of what ethics tries to do is to bring a way to organize and frame some of these discussions so that it can start to provide a means by which these can be explored and discussed and hopefully in at least some of the cases some type of resolution reached that will be better for everybody involved. So with that, we'll also much more in our residential course be looking at a number of different ethics cases and ways that those can be used to help to talk through and in some cases resolve some of these issues. So this, for some of you, this may be an area of medical practice that you have a lot of experience in and maybe taken other coursework, but for others of you, this may be a relatively new area. So today I want to lay out some general material Some of you with more experience in this area may find this very basic, but I think this will help to bring us all to a similar understanding of what we're trying to do through this module and how ethics can be something useful in a very practical way. So ethics, really the systematic study of issues of right and wrong, areas where people are saying we should do this or we shouldn't do that, this is the right way to act, this is the wrong to act, all those types of things, where different arguments will then be brought forward. People will say, these are the reasons that we should be doing this, these are the reasons that's the wrong way to approach this thing. But in addition, ethics also is involved with character qualities. And this is part of why I think ethics can become very personal and sometimes very controversial, because when we get into talking about whether people are being honest, whether they're being faithful, whether their character qualities are important or the team that they're part of, and that can become very difficult and personally challenging to discuss. But I think that's part of what the ethical methods try to provide is a way to think these things through. Another term that's commonly used in these discussions is morality or morals. And for our purposes, we'll really use the terms for ethics and morals interchangeably. They can have a subtle distinction where morality can refer to broader traditions of right and wrong involving society and culture and religion, whereas ethics tends to focus more on the thinking part around putting together an argument, provide various ethical positions. But as I said, for the most part, our interactions can use the words interchangeably. Then another term is virtue, virtue ethics, and this is the part that does focus in on the ethical character qualities that are involved in decisions and actions. So here the virtues would be things like honesty, fidelity, a person being of just character, being a person who looks to promote fairness and things like that. So when we are trying to talk about the personal characteristics that make for ethical decision making, that's where virtues is typically used. And then the other point I'd just like to say is that within this unit, there is also going to be consideration of the legal dimensions of disaster medicine. And while ethics and law are closely interrelated, they are distinct. There are going to be situations, I think we've seen throughout history, that various people would say that certain laws were passed in various countries, but were viewed as being unethical. Or in other situations, people may be saying that there is something ethical that needs to be promoted, and as a result of that, certain laws need to change. But again, our focus here in this particular part of the unit is not going to be on the law, and there's going to be other discussions in that area, but instead we'll be looking at ethics, which is really the types of thinking that goes on prior to the development and passing of various laws, where you're looking at, well, what are the right things to do and to put into practice in various laws. Now, as soon as we start talking about ethics, I think there are some people who will say, well, that's fine for some of you guys in the universities that have plenty of time to sit on the sidelines and think about these ethical issues. But those of us in the real world that is just really busy and that we've got so much to do, we just have to get along with our practices, our lives, and we don't have time to think through all these issues as well as others might. Well, I think there certainly is a case for the fact that life is busy, and in a busy practice in the middle of a disaster setting, there is a huge focus on action, on getting things done. and that taking a couple of hours out to just think about what we're doing may be a real challenge in that situation. But as Christy mentioned in the introduction, there still is a very important place for thinking about the ethics of what we're doing, even in the midst of a busy situation. And certainly in preparing to go into a disaster setting, there should be time spent thinking about what would we do if we were faced with this dilemma? What types of skills do we need in order to resolve conflicts where maybe some of the responders are from one culture where a totally different thing is viewed as the right way to do things compared to people from our culture who may be responding to add into that the culture of those who are the recipients of the medical care. They may have another view of what the right things are. And part of what we're hoping that this unit will provide is a way to reflect on some of these things ahead of time, maybe for some of you reflecting on things you've already been exposed to, and in that way helping to prepare yourself for the dilemmas that you're going to confront when you go into these situations. Now, some people with experience in disaster response may realize that, well, this is a highly complicated and difficult situation. You're going to have issues around ethics that are just all jumbled together, where you've got people saying that, there's questions of vulnerability, that this creates enhanced reasons to be particularly careful, to be particularly open to different viewpoints. There's an urgency, there's people suffering, there's distress, and how are we going to think through all of these sorts of issues? You add into that issues of religion, for example, maybe different views on how a dead body ought to be treated, how quickly it ought to be buried, where it ought to be buried or not buried, and a whole variety of other different religious ideas that impact on decisions that have to be made fairly quickly. Then you've got legal issues are somehow involved, possibly. You've got ethical concerns and cultural practices, which may include religious ideas or may have more to do with how men and women interact with one another, whether older people are to be treated first or treated last, various things like that. And so the ethical dilemmas in a research or in a disaster situation may appear to just be a complicated mass of different issues. And this may lead some people to say, well, this is just, too difficult. It's just somebody just has to come in and make a decision and we'll all get on with it. But what ethics tries to do is not so much make the decision and tell everybody this is the only thing that can be done here, but instead we'll try to take the complicated set of parameters that the last slide and find a way to organize the issues so that we start to say, well, what really is crucial to address here? Is this an issue of the privacy of patients, or maybe this privacy issue just isn't a factor in this situation? Is it an issue of consent? Is it one of harm versus benefit? Is it one of limited resources where no matter what we might like to do, we just don't have enough resources to be able to do that? And then with those other issues that I mentioned of religion, ethics, law, where do they engage here, or maybe not? Maybe some of these are completely irrelevant to some of the dilemmas that people face in the field. So ethics will try to provide a way to sort these out and see which are the key, and it will identify that there isn't always a nice, neat, clear path, that you won't be able to start with point 1, get to point 7, and there's your answer. That many are interrelated. We think we've got one item resolved, and instead we see that there's a whole other set of issues that need to be examined. Part of what medical ethics has shown to ethics more broadly is that these sorts of dilemmas can't be thought about for days and weeks or years like some academic discussions have been going on certain topics, that in a medical setting, an action is going to have to be made. This may be an action that you'll only have seconds to think about, and something has to be done. And part of what ethics and ethical evaluation would be, when those actions are made, that the outcomes need to be fed back into our thinking. We need to be reflecting on the ethical decisions that we made yesterday. Did they lead to good outcomes? Did they really promote the types of ethical values and cultural values that we were hoping? Or maybe they didn't, and therefore tomorrow we need to do something differently, not because our values have changed, but because we realized that particular action didn't promote those values in the ways that we were really hoping for. So ethics then tries to organize these discussions and provide a framework for thinking them through. What it will also start to do is make it clear where a different action may actually cause of different beliefs on a couple of these points. So, for example, the green arrows move off after one of the particular points, and you have a divergence on the ways that beliefs are held there. But that what starts to appear then is that there is actually a large set of parts of the discussion on which both sides on a disagreement may actually agree on those parameters. So, for example, on whether to amputate or not, whether that's the right decision or not in a particular situation or with a particular patient, there may be a disagreement on ultimately the amputation should or should not take place. But when there's just an initial dilemma, there could be opinions of people starting to say things like, you don't care enough, or you don't really put the patient's well-being in the right priority, all those things. But having organized the debate and realized what different values are involved, it should start to appear that actually everybody in this debate holds to certain common values. For example, that everybody would say that the patient's well-being needs to be promoted, that we need to use our resources wisely, but that on a couple of issues there could still be a disagreement. And part of what I think this sort of ethical decision-making process can start to do is help people who disagree on the final ethical decision to see that actually the other side are not these evil monsters. They're not people who've got a totally different set of values. We actually have quite a bit of common ground, but that on a particular couple of points we do have a disagreement. And so even if an ethical dilemma cannot be resolved to everybody's satisfaction, what hopefully will happen is that people will come to agree that they do see the ways that other positions have got good points in their argument, where they do see that there is agreement on a number of factors, and that therefore any type of personal animosity or antagonism can be reduced, and that people will be able to work together even if they identify that they still disagree on the final whether or not, in this case, a particular amputation should happen. So this is where ethics, even if it doesn't lead to a unanimous decision, will hopefully promote a better working environment through its process and mechanisms. So I like this quote from a book. It's a real nice short book if you've got access to it. It's a very good summary of the basics of ethical decision making. But Raphael says, if you're faced with a dilemma on what is the right thing to do, moral philosophy, that's another name for ethics, will not find a decision for you. What it can do is remove some confusions and clarify some obscurities so that the options stand out more plainly. And in that way, we will really be able to realize this is why I've come to my conclusions and why I think this is the right thing to do, and then be able to understand why others might be seeing that a different approach is the way that they would like to move forward. So what exactly then does the process of ethical decision making seek to do? So the clarification step is often focused around identifying the core ethical principles that are in disagreement or that are involved in a particular case that is ethically controversial. We'll be talking much more about this during the residential course, but just to give you a brief exposure to some of these key terms, much of medical ethics has developed around what's called the four principles approach, where many ethical dilemmas can boil down to different priorities being reached around these four particular principles. You'll see that these are really the basics of medical ethics in any context. So, for example, beneficence is the idea that practitioners should act in the best interest of the patient. So the idea of benefiting patients is a key ethical principle. And kind of its flip side is the principle of non-malfeasance. This is the idea that's kind of traced back to Hippocrates and the earliest code of medical ethics, the idea of first do no harm, that medical care should make sure as much as possible that it isn't going to harm. Then autonomy is the belief that patients have the right to refuse any treatment or to choose the treatment that they want to have to make. So this is a principle that has varying levels of priority placed on it in Europe and the US. It's often viewed as a very high priority ethical principle, and so there's a great focus on patients being able to make their own decisions regardless of what others might think of those. But in other parts of the world, this principle may not be held to the same priority, and so that can often be a source of some of the dilemmas when people from different countries end up practicing medicine together, where, for example, decisions might be seen to be more ethical principle coming from different cultures. And then in disaster settings, the principle of justice is another key issue that comes up regularly. And this is the idea that when there are scarce resources or healthcare resources, that the decisions should be made in a fair and just way. But there are huge disagreements then about how exactly that should be done. And this is probably one of the most common dilemmas that you face in disaster settings. Do we decide based on need? Do we decide based on the likelihood of people people recovering fully? Do we focus more on short-term recovery or long-term gain? Should the how should those decisions be made? And so that is a real challenging one, and something that we'll talk much more about in the residential time. So just to kind of elaborate a little further on some of the other, some of these principles, the idea that dignity is a core ethical value that ought to be promoted is very commonly held, and certainly when you look at human rights, they really stress. So here is where even if you can provide medical treatment or can't provide medical treatment, that the dignity of the patient should still be promoted in the ways that they are treated, related to, and talked to in the ways that are feasible. And then obviously, dignity applies not just to individual patients, but to cultures, to communities, and even after death, it applies to the dignified treatment of the body and the importance of appropriate burial. Fidelity is a somewhat different principle then that relates much more to the interactions between healthcare practitioners and patients. And so the faithfulness of the relationship that exists between the doctor and the various other people that they interact with to be promoted. And then also expanding out into the ways that they engage with other important relationships. So there's a relationship with the team that our organization that has sent them, and that can become complicated. And then finally, kind of stemming on from the principle of fidelity is the importance of truthfulness and honesty, and where and how this exactly should be promoted, particularly in difficult settings surrounding disaster responses. So how we would like you to engage with this material is that when the background reading materials are released maybe tomorrow, included there are going to be a case study that we'd like you to start to think about and then to discuss in the forum. So this case study is it's a real case that has been reported in the literature. And it reveals a number of different ethical dilemmas. So what we'd like you to do is to read it through, think about how might you respond, how do you think you should respond, how do you think others should respond, and that there are different people involved in this case. And then just start to bring out your thoughts and reflections in the forum, and we'll get some discussion going then there over the next few weeks. Then in the residential coursework, we have got a few articles that we're putting up there as well that we'd like you to review and talk about. And then in the time that we have in Navarra, then we will be looking at some other cases and elaborating on some of the things that you've been thinking about. There is one other area of particular ethical concern that we want to talk about, and this may actually be something that some of you will need to address in your research projects as you're getting work initiated on those. And that is the whole area of research around disasters. One of the United Nations documents in this area is the Hyogo framework for action that has been looking at improving the various strategies for disaster response, looking at everything from disaster preparedness, disaster risk analysis, and then also looking at the response issues. But in its midterm review in 2011, it concluded that much of the existing operational research related to emergencies and disasters lacks consistency, is of poor reliability and validity, and is of limited use for establishing baselines, defining standards, making comparisons, or tracking trends. Of itself is an ethical concern. If disaster research has been occurring now for a number of years, how come its results are really not helping to guide the decision making that's needed in this area? At the same time, this finding and that of other reports has been leading to a real strong push to carry out more research on disasters, including research into the medical responses and the types of medical decisions that need to be made during those responses. So there is a large increase in the amount of disaster research that is being carried out. And for that reason, there's a lot of concern that this research be carried out in ethically appropriate ways. So some of the types of situations that have led to ethical dilemmas that are then led on into the need for further evidence the disaster in Haiti in 2010. So, for example, there was one of the research team, or one of the medical response teams, sorry, that out of 581 patients, they carried out 45 amputations, whereas one of the other teams from the Swiss Army saw 150 patients, and yet they had one amputation that was that their group carried out. And this has led to the question then about, well, why would one team have a much higher proportion of amputations compared to another? Was this purely, were these decisions made out of a medical evaluation of the patient's needs? Or were there other values, other ethical priorities that were brought into these decisions that may or may not have been appropriate? Which of these general findings would have been closer to the more ethical approach? So that has led to a real concern about collecting data that will help us to answer why this difference occurred, and then what actually is the more appropriate type of standard way to address these issues. So addressing these sorts of areas where there are vast divergences in the standard ways that medical decisions are made has led to this call for a lot of research. So there is an underlying ethical imperative that really has to do with the importance of providing information, providing evidence that will seek to help make better decisions out there. So, for example, now there are various funding mechanisms that are developing to actually fund research into various outcomes, various safety aspects, and also the effectiveness. If drugs are going to be used in a disaster setting, do they have the same effectiveness as in a standard setting? That type of research is going to require studies being done in the midst of those settings. And then there's also secondary research going on. This is part of how I got involved in this whole area through the Cochrane collaboration, and they have set up an area called Evidence Aid, which is to provide systematic reviews of all the evidence available for a disaster response on a particular topic. And so the hope here is that as more of this evidence is being reported, that they will be able to provide it in useful ways that will help the decision makers as they respond to disasters. So leading out of that then, I mentioned that there's an EU project that I'm part of that I helped to set up and get funded, and we've been looking at a number of different aspects of the ethical issues in response to disasters. This is something that for any of you that are based in the EU that you might be interested in getting involved with us. So I've put on there our website where you'll find more information. As we hold various conferences, we try to put as much of our information up on our website so that it's available for others to use. We currently, at the moment, have a call out where we're looking for ethical cases where people are willing to report on these so that we can provide them in training materials around those. And for example, last week we had our most recent meeting in Malta looking at the various issues that are coming up with refugees from various disasters, particularly conflict-focused ones. But identifying there the many ethical issues around how refugees are being responded to. Obviously, there's a close tie-in there with the various legal responses that exist there, but as well trying to ensure that people who do make it to Europe and are then going to be met with ethical treatment when they're in the various centers where they have to wait while their legal status is being processed. So that's another area of resources we're building up. And if that's something that you're particularly interested in, we certainly will be able to talk about that when we're in Novara, and we've got plenty of opportunities for people to get involved with us there if that interests you. So that takes me to the end of the formal part that I wanted to talk to you about at this point. I don't know if Christy would like to add any comments after hearing this, and then we could open it up for questions to anybody who would like to do so.
Yes, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One is the humanitarian assistance is a very hot topic in the international community right now, and I know many of you are involved in responding to disasters, so that's something to pay attention to. I'll actually be participating in a meeting in Washington, D.C. in a couple of weeks, an international conference where we're looking at the Hugo framework and how that's being implemented, and it's in collaboration with colleagues in Japan and Australia and other places in the world. So we'll have some more information at the residential course on that. But the whole idea of professionalizing the humanitarian response is a very important and hot topic, as was illustrated by the example with the amputations and what was the right thing to do in that setting and how complex that is. The second thing I'd like to highlight is for you to think about the ethical principles and the idea that in certain settings you may have a conflict where one ethical principle would dictate one course of action and another one would dictate a contradictory course of action. So while we have these